So we'll see how that goes. Okay, this is one we didn't quite finish the last time. We were talking about invention and innovation, the difference, and also the struggle one often has to go through when you have a good idea. People are very often very skeptical, right? It's very easy to be skeptical and say no and shake your head, it will not work. Well, in many cases that is correct, but sometimes, you may kill a very, very good idea. And, some of these quotes reflect the thinking of the time. So we have been talking about being creative and inventive. It's always within some kind of context. So Galileo Galilei, he's a famous astronomer from the 16th and 17th century. And he said doubt is the father of invention. And why did he say that? Well, of course, he was talking about the earth being round, and he was talking about the earth moving around the sun, and that was completely contrary to what the church was preaching, because the church was preaching that the earth is the center of the world and everything moves around the earth. And so what he's essentially saying that his inventions or creativity are related to that he doubts that what people are saying is correct, right? So that's how that goes. And this is the classical one. Necessity, is the mother of invention. That's the one we have seen before. So when you really need something, then you have to be creative. And that goes to circumstances around having to think of a good solution on a practical problem. An amazing invention, but who would ever want to use one? And this was when the US president made a call from Washington to Pennsylvania with Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. That was patented in 1876. So he couldn't see any use of a telephone. And he was the president of the United States. So obviously, sometimes when we talked about disruptive inventions, sometimes the inventions come before the market, and this is obviously one where the invention came before the telephone market. But we know what the telephone market is like today. It's probably one of the biggest industries on the earth. And this one also showing skepticism. Everything that can be invented has already been invented. And this was the commissioner of the US Patent Office. He thought that everything possible had been invented by the end of the 19th century. So, was he ever wrong? This one, the bomb will never go off. I speak as an expert on explosives, and that saying that I'm an expert and I know it doesn't work is an example of somebody using authority to kill an idea. Well, in this case, of course, it was the atom bomb, which one, of course, could argue whether that was a good invention or not. 640K ought to be enough for anybody, Bill Gates. So, Well, I guess he had to eat that one later on. But I know IBM, they were the first to make supercomputers. And supercomputers in those days were what you have in your pocket today. And IBM said that there will be enough with 3 or 4 supercomputers in the world. And that is only, let's say, in the 80s. So it's less than 30 years ago. But this one is much more positive. Where a new invention promises to be useful, it also ought to be tried. And that was Thomas Jefferson, the father of the American Declaration of Independence. So he was a thinking man, and obviously with a very positive attitude. So what I'm saying is, generally we should be very positive. At the same time, before things go too far with the wrong ideas, one should also have some sort of process to be critical. So this is a balance you have to learn. Huh. Picture. I don't know where that went. That was a fun picture.
If you create the gap alternative to visualize between
which one?
R A.
Oh, this one?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, maybe that's what the one I should have used for the animations as well. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So this goes back to the Stone Age, right? He has invented the wheel, and those guys are using a square wheel, and they say we are not interested in that invention because we are so busy doing what we are doing. And of course, having a wheel like that makes them very busy. So what I said, we are not going to repeat this, but inventions and innovations happen within a wider social context. And we have to be aware of that can be positive, but it can also be negative. It can, if the environment is supportive, then it's positive. If the environment is the opposite, hostile, negative, too busy to care, then of course the social context can be negative. But also, if we are talking about this society, and what I personally feel is the most important driver for being creative and inventive is things that we see that the society, the world needs, right? Now we need solutions that have to do with energy and pollution and that sort of thing. And also here, companies should encourage employees and organizational units to become more innovative. And this is something we are going to talk about, methods for creating a more innovative environment. And this is important for you. Not only should you become very creative and inventive and start with patenting and that sort of thing, but if you also become a manager in the future, your attitude is very important when it comes to creating an environment that is able to come up with something new and important. So one can ask, creativity, is that an individual property. What do we mean by that? Is that something that is kind of from your birth? Some of you were born being creative and some others were born not being creative? Or is it a function of your upbringing, or that is your parents, your family, or is it, you know, the whole social context in which you have been living? So if you're born with it, then we say it's genetic. And obviously people like Archimedes and Leonardo da Vinci, they were extraordinary people. They were not typical of their time. So obviously they had some DNA, so to speak, that made them more creative and more, of course, extremely intelligent people. The upbringing certainly is very important. Education, because if you're going to invent something that has, as we talked about, a knowledge content, and an invention with a high knowledge content is normally much more valuable than a simple one, then education is important. But also, we should not look down upon practical experience. I'm not sure if Malcolm McLean was extremely intelligent, or he was primarily a practical man that saw from his work that containers were very important. What do you think? Well, obviously, he would never have invented containers if he had been sitting in a university, would he? I don't think so. Not even with, you know, brains and good education, he would not have invented containers. And it turned out to be an extremely important invention, wasn't it? That changed the whole industry. So all of these factors are important, and somehow they play together. And we need people of this category, we need people of this category, we need certain education and so on. We need all of this. And that's why also often it's important to work in a team. Of course you can be smart sitting in your own room and thinking about something very, very hard. But normally, if you come up with an idea and you work together with people who have maybe knowledge beyond what you have and practical experience beyond what you have, then the combination of these things will become much more powerful. So now we're getting more into techniques. So, of course, these factors we just looked at are very important, but there are, techniques that can help us in stimulating the process of creating good ideas. And one is association, and that is, for instance, you need a certain type of remedy, something to help you doing something. You would like to invent something, and then you start thinking about how they do that or similar thing in other places. And then you can associate, you can combine thoughts. So not just think of your specific problem, but you can think of similar problems and how they have solved this, and then by association, by combination, you can maybe come up with a good idea. Analogy, something being analogous. What does that mean? It's a similarity. It's kind of a parallel problem. For instance, in ocean systems engineering, we may be able to learn a lot from aerospace engineering, right? There are analogous problems, similar problems in aerospace, like fluid structure interaction, right? Some critical points where, let's say, the dynamics become uncontrollable unless you do something. And that is analogy. When you look at, this problem, and then you have the other problem that has similarity, and then you can come up with something. Excursion, that is kind of taking off in a certain direction and see if you discover something. So these are called soft techniques. So it's possible to set up a group and ask the group to start working with association or an analogy or taking off on an excursion, not physically but mentally an excursion. Then there are what here is characterized as hard techniques. Challenge. You as a manager go up to Peter and say, Peter, you have not come up with a single new idea the last 2 years. You challenge him, right? And Peter starts shivering, and but he may get scared, or he may become inspired to do something. He has a challenge from his boss. So that is one technique that you could, be sensitive when it comes to the environment in which you do something like this. Confrontation. That is a harder version of a challenge. You go to Peter and say that, well, you have not invented anything during the last 2 years. If you don't come up with a new idea, you have to walk out the door in 2 weeks, right? It's a confrontation. It's really head-on. So that is a rather brutal way of doing it. And then the provocation, what would that be? Well, you may look for a weak point in a person and provoke the person by pointing that weak point out to him, or even worse, doing it in a group with other people. Then it becomes really embarrassing, right? It's not very nice to do it. But maybe if there's a person who, after you try these techniques, you have to be even more brutal. And maybe in the end, that's what you need to do in order to make something happen. So you see the difference between, well, of course, in the university, we are normally here on the soft side, right? In the industry, it's more this category. But if you are the manager who kind of have to select here, you have to be sensitive. You have to, the point is really not to provoke a person. The point is to obtain some results, some change. That's what you want people to change. And you see, there's something called the comfort zone. You know what the comfort zone is? When you're comfortable, right? Comfort zone. So I could provoke you a little bit now, and I could say, you are not asking me questions because you like to be in your comfort zone. When you're sitting here listening to me, you feel pretty comfortable. But if you have to ask me a question, that may not be quite as comfortable, right? You're too comfortable. So, you have to get out of your comfort zone. And this is something you have to learn. And of course, taking the first step is normally the worst. But if you do that more often, of course, it's not so hard to get out of this comfort zone. So you have to practice at getting out of your comfort zone. Think about it. Then, instead of this influencing sort of technique that can be soft or hard, you can try facilitation. What do we mean by facilitation? Well, provide the circumstances for things to happen. A facility could be a room, or it could be the environment you are working in. But it can also be facilitation through assistance. You assist the person. So you can help in strengthening the person's intuition. Women are said to be more intuitive, have better intuition than men. You agree? Our female student, do you agree? Do you have good intuition? Women often have a feeling for something, and somehow, and often you cannot explain it. You can see that something is right or wrong, and you cannot really say why you think it's right or wrong, but you have an intuition, you have a feeling for it. And when it comes to being creative, and maybe your intuition can help you come up with a good idea. So let's say awareness around intuition. And then there may be some barriers. One barrier may be your own culture. It's not common that you go to the boss and tell him that I think I know a better way of producing this product than you're doing in the company. That could be difficult, right? So that's a typical cultural barrier where, let's say, you have a more hierarchical system where one normally sends messages from the top and down, and not so much messages from the bottom and up. So that may be a part of the culture. But if a good boss would be aware of this, so he may say, hey guys, let's get together and talk about this problem and see if we can find a solution. So, and you may have already thought about a way of doing something, but since your boss is telling you to come together and have sort of a workshop where everyone can come with ideas, then you remove the barrier we talked about, the cultural barrier of sending a message up. So then you facilitate, help people come with these good ideas. And we also have other techniques. Of course, this can be, given different names, and I'm sure some people are only working with this sort of thing and not really doing it in practice, but we are more concerned with the practice. But you can have a systemic approach, analytical approach, where you have sort of a recipe, a instructions sheet for how you should go about coming up with idea. And maybe that instruction sheet says something, do this, do that, do this, do that. And from that process you may come up with some good ideas. So that would be that sort of technique. Coaching, that is when you have let's say you are a young employee, and there's a person who is more experienced than you are, and he will help you, kind of hold you in your hand, saying, let's do this together and I'll provide you with some of my experience in this process. Then he is a coach, almost like a football coach, right? So he helps with providing the process, and he helps with information and maybe even instructions. Okay, now we'll do something that we'll work on Monday. So I'll help you define the problem that has to do with innovation, and then on Monday I'll give you some more instructions or some more background techniques, and then we'll have kind of a creativity session together on Monday. And on Wednesday next week we'll summarize what you have achieved. So we talked about third generation R&D, and we talked about the importance of bringing together knowledge and technology with business, so the business strategy should be unified with the technology strategy, the research plans, and so on. These things should fit together in order to become powerful for the company. The company strategy, once that has been laid, may state that the company wants to break into a new market segment. That could be one challenge. So a market that one has not been in before, and I would think some of the large companies in Korea many times have done exactly that. So when Samsung is working in so many disciplines in industry, obviously they didn't start with all of that at the same time. They started more probably on the heavy industry side, and then step by step expanded into different sectors. So that is to break into a new market segment. But to do that with less experience than in competitors, you have to have something special. And that could be a new and highly competitive product, which you, at the point when you lay the strategy, you don't have it. A strategic approach is normally a company top-down approach. The message sent down in the system, now we are going to do this, and you have to do this and that. But it's obvious that the top management cannot solve this challenge alone. Certainly when it comes to more technical matters, they have to rely on the organization. And we'll become more specific regarding this kind of situation, which is more general. We will look at this now for a case of a shipbuilder. So, case study. So the case study of innovation challenge. So we look at a case where a company is faced with a challenge, innovate or die. That's kind of the dramatic version of it. The axe, right? Or, you know, the sign of danger or death. So we look at the particular case where a shipbuilding company is losing out in the competitive market with its current products, and the management realizes that the company has to take dramatic measures in order to survive. That's what it says here. They have to do something dramatic because they are beginning to lose money. And once you are losing money, of course, you will not survive very long. You become bankrupt. So we look at this. So this is the basis for that. I'll define this a little bit further now, next 10 minutes, and then you should think about it over the weekend. You can look upon it as kind of homework, but you don't have to send anything to me in terms of a solution. But you should think about it before we meet on Monday, because on Monday we are going to talk about this. So we'll do this as a part of a brainstorming exercise on Monday. And I hope you find this case interesting. We'll look at the LNG market. LNG, as most of you know, stands for liquid natural gas, right? LNG, it's cooled down to minus typically 164 degrees at atmospheric pressure, or it can be a combination also of pressure and cooling. If you do it at ambient temperature, then we talk about, that is room temperature, then it's compressed natural gas. But the more pressure you have, the more dangerous it becomes. So it's turned out that liquid natural gas is a very good way of transporting gas when the distance is too long to have a pipeline. So this is partly statistics and partly projections, and I can say right away that of course there has been some adjustment during the last year due to the financial crisis, that maybe some of these curves have not grown quite as fast as they should have according to these diagrams during the last year. But there has been a growth So it has been more a kink, and now probably very soon it will get back on these curves. So it's quite obvious when you look at the Pacific Basin, and the reason why we talk about these basins is that the LNG ship traffic, the LNG carriers, cross these oceans, the Pacific or the Atlantic Basin. So, and we see traditionally it's been Japan that's been the big importer of LNG. Korea has been the second biggest. Taiwan, and I think this one, India, will probably grow much more than this. But at the same time, India is also trying to be connected with a gas pipeline. So how much will come as LNG and how much will come through pipeline, we don't know yet. China, and maybe China will grow more than this. Of course, China is basing very much of its energy on coal, which is not very good. So natural gas is much cleaner. So you have the American West Coast there, and others. And the Atlantic, you have continental Europe, then the mainland of Europe. You have UK, and this is very strange, isn't it? UK suddenly appears here. Why is that? Well, of course, UK has been using a lot of gas for many years, but all their own gas reserves are empty, or nearly empty, so they have to start importing gas, right? And North America, they are trying also to shift from coal to natural gas. Comment?
So actually, the data maybe will be changing in the near future.
Yeah.
So because I saw some different information for the shale gas.
Yeah, I'll get back to that.
Yeah.
Okay. I know about shale gas. But good point. Good point. So we have these LNG trade routes. We have traditional routes, and we have newer trades, for instance, from northern Norway. From Melkøya, there's a big gas field up here at Norway where they have started liquefying gas, LNG. And of course, typically when you are up here, you have no other way of exporting the gas than using LNG. And West Africa is coming. There's a big step up of export of gas from the Middle East, from the Emirates and so on, and Algeria, and there's many places where they are building liquefaction plants for LNG. West Australia, etc., are also there. So, so they are typically they are pretty long trading routes. For the short distance, one would use pipelines. And this one should be correct. It is the LNG fleet development in terms of number of carriers of vessels since the 60s. So there's been a tremendous growth, and recently a very steep curve as well. Of course, there are times when the economy becomes more uncertain and one puts on the brakes. So maybe there have not been many new orders to the order book during the last year or two. But to some extent, that is evened out also when things get going again. But this is interesting. Vessels over 30 years old. Well, it depends, of course, on the state of the ship when you will scrap it. So it could be because of corrosion and, you know, maybe bad maintenance, but it could also be that, you know, the ship is really inefficient. And these are the numbers of ships in operations that pass 30 years, and of course it's very easy also to write this for the coming years because you know how many ships were built a certain number of years ago. So this kind of curve is very easy to make because you know how many ships were produced back then. Okay, so there is a considerable number of ships that is very close to death, so to speak. But because of the market, they may have been kept a little bit longer than they should have. Vessel size, average size, the largest max size you see now is passing 250,000 cubic meters. And of course that is, why is that? Well, it's economy of scale. The larger, the more efficient. If you think of how much you carry, how many people you have, how many units you have to handle the transport. For instance, if you are going to export so many 1,000 cubic meters from one place to another, by having very large vessels you need fewer, right? So that's something that the ship owners are considering, but there has been a technical barrier and some technical difficulties having to do with size. This is something that we are coming back to in this course, and we are not really going to talk very much about technology. But 98 or 99% of the LNG ships, the LNG carriers today, are made of these two types of tanks. That is either the spherical tanks of Moss Rosenberg or the membrane tanks, either Invar but lately more corrugated stainless steel. And you see these enormous tanks in the ship. So one tank can be 45-50,000 cubic meters. And lately also there have been technical problems with damage. This is something we're going to talk about also. And the difficult situation is when you have partially filling. There is a Japanese tank which is very, very solid and strong, like the spherical tanks, but it turns out to be very expensive also. So that's a so-called self-carrying tank, which has some merit to FPSO floating production units, but hasn't become a solution really for ships. So the LNG, and we are always talking about transport when we are talking about LNG. I mean, nobody would make LNG and then use the LNG there. LNG is for transport. And this market, regardless the little dip we may have had, is growing rapidly. A large number of ships, these are the facts, are being phased out because they are getting too old or are not suitable any longer. There's clearly a competitive advantage by having larger ships, economy of scale. We saw this, you know, the maximum size. It's like computers. One would like to have bigger and bigger. Of course, there is a limit. There are plans for future offshore LNG production and regasification. One would like to have it offshore, or of course also the gas field may be offshore. So rather than bringing the gas to shore and liquefying there, one could have a floating system where you do the liquefaction out on the water. There's a problem with conventional membrane tank technology because you can have severe damage, and particularly if you have partial filling. So the market really wants more rugged tanks, preferably double barrier tanks with good insulation, self-carrying tanks. Well, there's clearly a need for new types of large tanks that can allow severe weather and partial filling. So that's the problem. And you mentioned shale gas, and I've been thinking about shale gas too. So there's a kind of a disturbing factor that in the United States they know and have known for a long time, and particularly in the state of Texas, they have something called shale gas, which is shale is layered rock, right, sedimentary rock, and very hard attached in this mineral structure. There are gas associated gas, but it's very hard to get out. And therefore they have to use water, they have to use hydraulic fracturing and all sorts of things, and it turns out to be a pollution problem. But because of the political situation and the want to reduce import, the United States and Canada are very much thinking about this. So this is an uncertainty. So if you're laying out the strategy, you also have to think about the risk factors. So the last one, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit over time. So this is the problem. They know that there's a growing demand, even higher demand in the future. Market uncertainties because of the financial crisis and shale gas. This company that we have to think about now has some experience from building LNG ships with licensed technology and external consultants, and they're very expensive. Some of them $1,000 an hour. It's crazy. But has not been able to differentiate itself and break into the market in a big way. The management believes that the best way to obtain success is to come up with new LNG containment product that is better for the customer and more profitable for the company. And this is very important, and this is what we really are talking about. The company has good and experienced technical staff of engineers, young as well as old, but has a rather weak record on innovation. So you see the picture? It's not very creative, but to survive they have to do something. So what we are going to brainstorm on Monday is how this company should go about coming up with these new products. So how should the management proceed? So we'll put this presentation now on the class website, so you can look at it again and you can think about this over the weekend, and then we'll work on it on Monday. So remember, on next week, on Wednesday next week, we'll start at 1 o'clock, 1 to 3, and on Wednesday the 29th, I think, is that a Wednesday? Then we'll have also from 1 to 3. Okay?